Chapter 1. Death in Retirement. "There's going to be a murder," said Miss Hazel, sitting at a table by the poolside. She was stroking a glass ball that balanced on the table, and the way she peered with widened, bulging eyes into the object gave her the air of one who was in the know about things that were going to happen. "Jolly good!" screeched Beatrice Jeffries. Her head swooped down, and she leaned forward to catch the eye of Dr. Culpepper, who was sitting in a white plastic chair opposite her. Dr. Culpepper was known as quite a mystery buff and had over the years solved many so-called unsolvable crimes. Murder was his forte. Although retired at the age of 72, he was interested in cases that baffled the authorities. He removed the book he had been reading from his lap and placed it gently on the table. "Murder indeed," said Dr. Culpepper, lifting the brim of his hat, revealing two chocolate-brown eyes that twinkled with honesty. His snowy white beard seemed like an extension of the summit of hair covering his large round head. The sun beat down on yet another perfect day in Sydney. Nevertheless, Culpepper was overdressed for the occasion. He wore a pin-striped suit covering a blue pullover. His long brown trousers were exposed at the bottom with a pair of well-shined and well-cared-for imported Italian shoes. Miss Hazel continued, "There's a man and a woman involved." Slowly she caressed the sides of the glass ball. Mysteriously, something glowed at its center. Only she could make out its meaning. "They will be committed right in front of everyone." Culpepper was quick to catch the mistake. "Miss Hazel," he said in a controlled, questioning manner, "did you not first say there would be a murder? The word 'they' most certainly implies that there will be more than one murder." His question was not meant to imply disbelief in mystic matters or their practitioners. Indeed, on one of his cases in India, he had once been given information from a well-known mystic, which had proven consequential in the capture of a very elusive character. No, he wasn't in doubt that something paralleled the living world. His doubt at present was in the ability of Miss Hazel to see anything beyond what her imagination had conjured up. At Chelmsford Manor, a retirement village with more than 300 occupants, Miss Hazel was one of the more colorful characters. She kept many people amused with her palm reading and tarot cards. Culpepper reckoned that most of her work was inspired guesswork, and that pre-knowledge of her victim's lifestyle was always helpful in her mysteriously knowing things about them. "A murder would definitely liven up the place," said Ruby Reeks, lying like a beached whale smothered in suntan lotion. Her 38-stone frame engulfed the sun chair she was lying on. It simply disappeared beneath her, causing the illusion that she was afloat in midair. "I mean, really, what do we do all day? Our most exciting event is betting if George White makes it to the dining room. Poor old Doddles gets lost sitting down," she added after a guttural chuckle. When she laughed, her whole body responded in a wave after wave of subcutaneous spasms. "Look, here he comes now," she said, waving her hand in the direction of the third floor. All eyes searched upward. Mr. White was being led out of his unit and attached to the railing which led to the dining room. Nurse Simone, too beautiful to be a nurse, with her aquamarine eyes and exquisitely white teeth, accompanied by her soft tanned skin, led him to the bar which, if he followed, would eventually lead him to the dining room. It was often George White's fate that he would let go of the railing and wander off. Today was not unlike any other. He started in a straight line. "I'll bet $5, said Ruby Reeks, still pointing her crooked finger, that man will not make the elevator." $10 says he'll make the elevator and get past Mira Evans' unit, shouted Miss Jeffries. "Really, ladies," said Culpepper, somewhat surprised at their callousness. "Is that the way to treat an old man, a judge at that? He's had 3 strokes in the last 6 months. You should be feeling sorry for him." "We feel sorry, all right, Doctor. Culpepper," said Miss Jeffries. "Make no mistake about that. He's simply sport. No one means anything by it." She rested back in her chair, taking in the proceedings. Culpepper had to agree that this form of entertainment seemed, on the face of it, harmless enough, although in the back of his mind rang the formidable words of Miss Hazel. There would be a murder. The others had momentarily turned their attention from Miss Hazel towards Mr. White. He was shuffling along the corridor one step at a time when suddenly his hand left the bar. He strolled to his right like a magnet attracted to metal. He bumped into the front door screen of the Shannons' unit. His face hung there against the fly screen, his body immovable. Matthew Shannon was sitting in his reclining chair in the lounge room when he heard the bump against his front door, instantly recognizing the face on the screen. He opened the door and led the old man back to the railing. "Stay on the straight and narrow, old chap," he said as he clasped Mr. White's hand across the metal bar. George gave an understanding smile and continued on towards the dining room. Behind him, Nurse Simone and Stanley the cleaner, both of whom had just finished the cleaning and nursing at the White's unit, had left Mrs. White, now in her late 80s, resting on her bed as her husband made his daily pilgrimage, unaware that people below at the swimming pool were placing bets on the probability of his arrival at his destination. "Look there, dear," said Ruby Reeks, pulling her sunglasses down over her large raspberry nose to get a clearer view. "You owe me $10. "Not quite yet," insisted Miss Jeffries. She watched as Mr. White made a momentary halt at the front door of Mira Evans' unit. He hesitated, then turned towards the door. There was something he wanted. What it was, he was uncertain, but on the other side of the door was something that compelled him to leave the metal bar. Slowly maneuvering his feet into position, he faced the unit straight on. "George White," came a shout from Miss Jeffries as she stood up, hands cupped to her mouth. "It's lunchtime, George. Get back on the railing." George heard the voice and gazed heavenwards. He squinted his brown eyes, trying to focus on the angel that had addressed him. The blue sky above was empty, except for one lone seagull which floated dreamlike on a blanket of brisk, warm air. "That's cheating," said Ruby Reeks condescendingly. Miss Jeffries turned around, swooping upwards and placing her finger alongside her nose, said softly, "Strategy, dear. All I'm using is strategy. Surely that is fair in this game." "Your bet," said Ruby, "was that Mr. White would get past Mira Evans' door. Verbal prompting is interference. Quite unallowable, I'm afraid. He's got to do it of his own accord." Miss Jeffries was not on to take defeat easily. She looked upwards where George White stood motionless, waiting for another divine voice of guidance. She clenched her fist and made a pulling motion, as though she had a puppet on a string. Miss Hazel might have had more luck controlling the mindless George, being the only mystic at Chelmsford Manor and the only one with such powers, but she was deep in concentration on more serious matters. The urge to find out what was on the other side of the door was stronger than the invisible string now, so gently broken from Miss Jeffries's grasp. George White shuffled forward and opened the screen door entering the unit. His nostrils immediately caught the aroma of food cooking. Food, dining room, sight at table. George sat at Mira's table and patiently awaited service. Mira Evans had just finished showering and dressing. She was thin and angular, but incongruously had a triple chin. Under the last fold of flesh and attached to her dress, she wore a golden brooch. She came down the hallway and passed by the kitchen with only a half glance. Inside, she noticed two large brown shoes sitting heels up under the kitchen table. She stopped mid-stride and, grabbing the corner of the doorway, pulled herself round onto the kitchen. There sat George White, his hands folded on the tabletop, his gentle brown eyes pleading for conversation. On his last stroke, he had lost most of his speech, but his thick eyebrows flicked upward in acknowledgement of Mira's presence. She glanced at her watch. It was 11:45, lunchtime. "Oh, George," she said patronizingly, "you've done it again, dear. You're supposed to be in the dining room." Mira's chins were of particular fascination for Georg. He sat there, dreamlike as they came forward, and dangled directly in front of his face. "Come, dear," she went on with affection. "I'll see you on your way." She led the most willing Mr. White out of her unit and once again attached him to the railing. "There you are now, George," she said in a comforting voice. "Just follow the railing. Don't use the elevator. You'll get lost again." It was then that George White made his first response since his heart attack. He put his hand on Mira Evans' shoulder and gave a gentle squeeze. A tear formed in the corner of her eye as she remembered the judge before all this unfortunate business, how he used to perk up a conversation when all mouths had dried up, and how it was he who had been considered by most of the residents of Chelmsford Manor to be somewhat of an intellectual. How unfortunate and unkind life could be, to let one who had been so full of life and had contributed so much to society just slip away unnoticed and forgotten. "Go on, George, get out of here," she said, wiping the sympathetic tear from her eye. "Don't let them think you're finished. Kick 'em in the arse." George clung to his life support system as though it were the umbilical cord returning him to his nourishment. He continued on his way, occasionally glancing down at the group assembled around the pool. "I told you he'd never make it," said Ruby Reeks defiantly. "He never makes it in one attempt. The poor soul. They should give him a needle or something." "That would be murder," said Dr. Culpepper solemnly. He had been watching the travels of Mr. White and had also noticed the extreme interest the two women placed in his demise. The nurse and cleaner had vanished, leaving George to make his way unaided. "You can't murder the dead," said Ruby Reeks. "Oh, let's not murder Doddles, he's far too sweet," said Miss Jeffries, now accepting defeat on one hand and encouraging disaster on the other. "If we must murder someone, let it be that bitch Beecham." Sandra Beecham was the administrator of Chelmsford Manor. She ruled with an iron hand and a venomous tongue. Being an ex-matron and the wife of one of the board members put her in a solid position. Nothing could remove her from the manor, short of an execution. Miss Jeffries had picked a likely candidate for murder. Miss Hazel drew back in her chair and, tilting her head slightly, said, "My, aren't we becoming bloodthirsty all of a sudden?" All eyes turned towards her. "All this talk of murder has brought out the primeval beast," said Dr. Culpepper, lighting his pipe. "But murder," interjected Miss Jeffries, "is far more mysterious than an accident or dying from old age. It gives one an element of intrigue." "I didn't say who I saw was going to be murdered," said Miss Hazel, pursing her lips. "It might even be you, Miss Jeffries." "Oh, well then, that would definitely take the mystery out of it," replied Miss Jeffries in idle contemplation. No, that certainly wouldn't do." She pondered on the thought, while Culpepper blew smoke rings above his head. Not one of them, he thought, had the slightest idea what murder was all about. To them, it was a form of entertainment. To him, it was an extension of an individual's character that caused them to overstep the boundaries of good versus bad, and commit an act so horrendous to the rational mind, yet acceptable to a mind so bent on destruction that it could carry out such an act without thinking of the consequences. Even knowledge of the death penalty could not deter a mindset of murder. A murderer was without a conscience during the act. "I think, ladies," said Culpepper, puffing on his pipe as he spoke, "that one encounters murder on a daily basis in the papers and on the television, and one becomes complacent. What you do not realize is the closeness of such a situation. That is, if a murder did actually happen here and now, it would become most personal. You would not look at it with the same complacency. You would indeed take it to heart." Miss Jeffries shivered at the thought, composed herself, and spoke. "I hadn't thought about it that way. I suppose there is an airiness about the whole thing that one doesn't quite appreciate." The gloominess of such business engulfed them and held them transfixed for a moment. The slamming of the outer corridor door broke the spell they were all clinging to. Sandra Beecham, accompanied by two men in white uniforms, entered the pool area. Sandra, dressed in a low-cut white dress that revealed breasts of ample proportions, led the way. She had an easy, identifiable stroll, which was more like a power walk. Each hand pulled the air backward and then rejected it at the backhand swing. Although petite in stature, she could hardly have been 5 feet tall, her long, determined walk brought everyone to a state of easiness. With her, she carried the glow of a woman twice her size. She made menacing, large steps forward, almost stomping the ground beneath her feet as if to crush it into non-existence. "I think I'll go and look in on Mrs. White," said Miss Jeffries with an anxious look at the approaching doom. "Don't go simply because the Antichrist is coming," said Ruby Reeks, chuckling in the chair. "All we need is a cross and some garlic, and we'll soon put her in her place." She broke into wild laughter, almost spilling herself from her seat, but Miss Jeffries's bravery was limited. Gossip she was into. The attack of Attila the Hun she was not prepared for. She made a hurried exit. The remaining party was soon overcome by the eminence of Sandra Beecham. "This way, gentlemen," she said, pointing a well-manicured fingernail in the direction of Ruby Reeks. The two men, one carrying a canvas stretcher with 2 wooden poles, moved forward and stopped short in shock at the sight of the mountainous flesh that had to be carried. Back to the waiting ambulance. The one carrying the stretcher looked down doubtfully at the stretcher, which seemed to have shrunk, and cast a pleading, embarrassed look towards his partner. Sandra Beecham Power walked forward. "Ruby," she said sharply with both hands digging into her hips, "these gentlemen are here to take you for your x-rays at Saint Georges. In the future, will you please meet them at the reception desk? My morning tea was interrupted. I'm not your private nursemaid." Ruby lifted herself up onto her elbows, staring at the canvas in the man's hand. "And what do they intend doing with that?" she asked, sucking in air. Her eyes bulged with curiosity. "We have to carry all patients to the ambulance, ma'am," came an honest reply. "Hospital policy." "What? On that?" Ruby gave a gurgling chuckle. "I've worn bigger band-aids." She broke into laughter, causing waves of fat to ripple across her anatomy. When Ruby Reek started laughing, she weakened considerably. She made several attempts to raise herself from the sun chair, but each attempt met with the same result. She flopped back and howled with laughter. "Gentlemen," said Dr. Culpepper, banging his pipe against the side of his chair, creating a little pile of ashes. "I think the lady needs assistance. Better give her a hand." He watched their expressions change from shock to desperation. The stretcher was instinctively dropped, and the two men advanced. One on each side of Ruby, they both took a hand and began pulling. Pull and roll and pull. They were doing nothing more than exercising limbs that had long forgotten the exercise, and again, they pulled. Sandra Beecham flew into a rage. "Are you men or wimps?" she shouted. The response from one of the men was subtle. "If you want her up so bloody much, why don't you lend a hand?" Exasperation filled her face. Sandra took the bait and hurried forward, grabbing a beefy forearm. The four of them danced through their tug of war. Ruby Reeks was steadily gaining weight as she went limp with laughter. "Now wait," scorned Beecham. "We'll do it by the numbers." She bent down, exposing, in the face of the man in front of her, a cleavage bordered on both sides by two perfectly formed breasts. Their smooth, silky skin held his eyes transfixed. "All right now," she said. 1, 2, 3. 2, said the assistant dreamily, still gazing at the bulbous protuberances. 2? Said Beecham, irritated. "I said 3. "No, 3 would be too much," said the near slobbering attendant. She looked down to where his eyes were staring and immediately tugged her dress upwards. "Perverts!" she scowled. "Now, do you think you can get your mind out of your pants long enough to get this woman up?" The countdown began again. On 3, each pulled with all of his or her might. Ruby Reeks almost reached a sitting position when she fell backward and bounced up halfway again. "Now!" screamed Beecham. "Pull like you've got a pair." The two attendants looked at each other in surprise. They were certain they each had a pair but didn't want to lose them lifting such a dead weight. Then it happened, within the confines of inertia. Ruby Reeks gave an almighty pull, trying to assist. Her pulling only resulted in matter flowing in an unintended direction. Over her head they went, straight into the pool. All three splashed down like three unsuspecting astronauts. A furious scream came from Beecham as she came up on the far side. "My hair is flat," she cried venomously. She patted the soggy remains of what had once been an impeccable hairstyle. She scurried from the pool and ran for her office. Ruby Reeks managed to roll off the sun chair, and going to the poolside plucked the two attendants from the water, dragging them to where they'd left the canvas stretcher. She picked up the ends of the poles and trudged forward, followed by the two embarrassed men who were both soaked to the bone. One said to the other, "I've got to get a proper job." "Hey, mate," said the other man. "Where do I sign up?" Dr. Culpepper said. "That was the most amazing piece of seamanship I've ever witnessed." Miss Hazel looked at him. A wry smile had crossed her face. So, it was untrue. The rumor that Sandra Beecham's perfectly created head of hair was a wig, and that she only wore it because she had become prematurely bald. Their thoughts were interrupted by Miss Jeffries's return. She was moving rather quickly, considering she suffered from palpitations if overstressed. She was muttering absently as she approached them. "Oh dear, dear, dear," she said, falling heavily into a chair. Her face was sheet white, and her eyeballs twitched nervously. There was sheer horror in her face. She tried catching her breath as she clutched her chest. A heavy pain stabbed deep into her, preventing the words from forming. Culpepper quickly rose from his chair, kneeling in front of her. He took her hand in his. It was wet with perspiration. "What is it, Beatrice?" said Culpepper, lifting her chin so their eyes met. "Beatrice," he said again. "Beatrice, Beatrice, Beatrice," the name echoed in her ears. Suddenly the fog lifted, and there staring at her were two beautiful brown eyes full of concern. "Oh, doctor, Culpepper," she cried. Tears ran down her cheeks. It was horrible, simply horrible. "What was horrible, Beatrice?" "Mrs. White," she gasped. "Mrs. White was horrible?" he questioned. No, no, not horrible, but dead. There, she had said it. But Beatrice, she was 84. Surely an old woman passing away can't affect you this way. Beatrice Jeffries looked him straight in the eyes. Her own eyes held a significant message. "Oh no," she said quietly. "We're all used to that here. I mean, that is one of the drawbacks at Chelmsford Manor. One sees old friends dying all the time." "Then what is the matter?" pushed Culpepper. She continued dreamily. "In fact, quite a few of my acquaintances would be quite happy to go, I'm sure. I mean, they're all virtually bedridden and have nothing to look forward to. There's Amelia Van Oppenheimer, for instance, and Sarah Lake, and Ivy Buttle, and Dorothy Witless." Culpepper tried to stem the flow of expendable females which seemed to go on forever. "Then what's so special about Mrs. White dying?" Beatrice made a little whimper of recollection. "The thing is," she gasped, "they wouldn't mind dying so much as long as it was of natural causes. But Mrs. White, Amy," Beatrice took a deep breath. "She didn't pass unassisted." She coughed back the words. She was murdered."